If you want to start a pub brawl, picture Greenie against a forestry worker. One wants to lay down their life for a tree, the other wants a job cutting the tree down. Tonight's guest has stood on both sides of the barbed wire fence separating these opposing views. She was once head of the Australian Conservation Foundation and these days leads Victoria's forest industries lobby. Meet Tricia Caswell. Tricia, thank you very much for coming to the Powerhouse.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Peter.
You've always been a fighter for causes. What's in this for you? I mean, why are you always, in a sense, shoving against the wheel?
Ever since I could talk, my mother said I was standing up for something, either myself or my little brother. My uncles in the bush said, you know, you're always standing up for student rights, you know, what are you all doing down there at university? But I wasn't really politicised at all.
Have you always wanted to set the world right?
No, I haven't. I thought you had to be a good girl and do well and work hard, and I worked like a dog when I was in primary school and then decided I wasn't going to do that because it made you very unpopular and being top of the class wasn't the best thing in the world. So,
you had time to be a bad girl too. We'll come to that perhaps later on. Let's have a look at the early days of Tricia Caswell.
I was born in Brisbane in 1948. That was a big year. It was the year that Australian workers got the 40-hour week. My dad was a typewriter mechanic who later set up his own small business. My mum was a girl from the deep north, from Charters Towers, who served in the family shop ever since she was 12. They were both very conservative in their politics. I was the second youngest of 5 children. We lived in what was then a working class northern suburb of Brisbane. It was the Grange. Our place was a hike up the hill from the tram terminus along unsealed streets. Brisbane was a very big, sprawling, weatherboard town then. It always felt a bit run down and unkempt, but it was always easy and generous. Primary school was not a happy time for me. I was Miss Goody Two-Shoes, very anxious to be the best, very anxious to do the right thing. It was lonely. So I decided that high school was going to be different. So off I went to Kelvin Grove State High School. This was much to my mother's horror. She wanted me to go to grammar school or to St Margaret's. No way, I said, I'm going off to Kelvin Grove with my closest mates. So I guess I always knew how to stand up for myself and probably for others if it really was warranted. In 1965, I won an American Field Service scholarship. I went to Cleveland, Ohio, right smack bang in the middle of America. Life in America for me was like that film American Graffiti. There were sexy footballers, there were convertibles, there were drive-ins, we had meals 4 times a day and the cafes were open at 2 a.m. It was just before America exploded with social revolution. I lived in Lakewood in Cleveland. It was an all-white suburb. People talked about the smoke moving in, and really what they meant was the blacks were becoming middle class and might invade their suburbs. So I was pretty miffed by that, and I felt like things had to change. After my year in Cleveland, Ohio, I was back at the University of Queensland doing an arts degree. I went away, learned a whole lot of things, met a whole lot of people, lived a very different sort of life and came back, and there it was again that I didn't really fit in. So maybe it was because I came from a working class background in Brisbane and my friends in the United States were middle class, and maybe I missed all of that. Then Christopher came to my rescue. He was pretty much a Prince Charming, tall, good-looking, supportive, concerned. So a year or so later, we got married. We went to Darwin, where he was an agricultural scientist, and I guess started a new life.
Tricia, back in those early days, did you feel different? Did you feel isolated?
I had lots of neighbourhood mates and there were tons of kids around, and of course everyone had big families, but I did feel different. I felt that I could sort of see that things weren't exactly as they appeared on the surface, and I always felt that I could tell what motivated people ahead of them telling me themselves. So yeah, I always felt slightly different. I always had aspirations that didn't seem to be the same as those around me.
How were they different?
Well, I loved classical music, for example. Though I knew nothing about it and we didn't have any classical music in the house, I felt that you needed to be able to understand music, understand the arts, but I had no reason to feel like this. I mean, my mother actually was quite musical and we had a pianola, as many people in those days did, but we had very few books in the house, no really sophisticated discussions until I was much older. So somehow I did feel that I aspired to things that weren't around me, but I couldn't have told you exactly what that meant.
So what was the big change? Was it going to America as a field student on a field scholarship and going to Cleveland, Ohio, which is a world away from Brisbane, Queensland?
It was one of the things that changed my life, for sure. It made me a public speaker. Mind you, my mother had sent me to art of speech since I was 5 and said that, you know, my brothers and sisters had learnt the piano and not kept it up. They were very naughty children for not keeping it up, so I was going to learn art of speech and I couldn't give that up, could I? So I had learnt to be a sort of public speaker and to be able to say things and to have opinions publicly. But it took some time when I came back. I didn't really get politicised in Brisbane.
Let's stay with the US for a moment, because you were there a couple of years after Kennedy's assassinated and Martin Luther King has made I Have a Dream, a few years after his I Have a Dream speech. Race was a very big issue. Hit you in the face in the United States.
Look, it was sort of under the surface still, but because I lived in an all-white suburb and some of my girlfriends wanted to have, you know, boyfriends who were black, then that's how it came to me, really. And then the discussion that emerged out of, well, how come that's not acceptable? Mind you, not that I sort of knew about, you know, race relations in any sophisticated way in Queensland, and coming from a family that had people on the land, they weren't exactly progressive on some of these issues, Peter.
So when you came back to Queensland, back to the University of Queensland, how did life appear in Queensland versus what you just experienced in the US?
Well, I was beside myself to make sure I could get through my exams. I didn't really understand what you had to do at university, so I really wasn't in the marches and the kind of the uprisings that had started around that time at universities. And
around Vietnam?
Yeah, around Vietnam. And then I left to go to Darwin, so I was really kind of quite apart from student life.
What about the search? What was going on? What were you really looking for? Because, you became a teacher, but you say yourself you weren't a very good one.
Well, I learned to become a good teacher. I was in the end. At the beginning, I really didn't know how to teach, and I had 60 kids in a class, so I taught myself how to teach, and at the end, I loved it. After 5 years, I learned how to teach, and was a good teacher for 5 years.
Did you think that's what you're going to do in life?
But it wasn't my chosen profession. No. And
what did you think?
Well, I thought I wanted to be a vet for a long time, and I was talked out of that, you know, by uncles who said I'd have to deliver calves in the, you know, up the paddock, and that was no life for a girl, was it, Chrissy? They said to my mother. And then I wanted to be an actor, and everyone said, well, you know, if you want to be unemployed, go ahead, sweetheart. So I had those notions, but they weren't really about being remembered. They were about what would make me feel good. I did like doing tasks and finishing them, and I was a bit of a perfectionist, I suppose. If I had an assignment, it had to be perfect, or you had to redo it and redo it and redo it. So I liked things that were ordered and had results on the ground. But I really didn't know about aspirations, and I never had a plan. I never had a plan for what I wanted to be.
You did throw yourself into acting, and you lived in Darwin and Perth for a time, and you were right into it. I mean, what do you take from it?
I was. I loved it, actually. I loved Shakespeare, I loved directing, I loved acting, I loved making the costumes, all the things you did when you're in amateur theatre groups like Darwin started out to be. It's now a professional group in Darwin. And then I did more semi-professional work in WA, in Western Australia. But I did at the end of that find that I didn't think that's what I wanted to do. So in Perth, I actually made a decision that I wanted to be a really good teacher.